Sometimes the loneliest place isn't an empty house. It's a life where you no longer recognize yourself. My name is Elena,
I'm 47,
and for the longest time, I thought I was living the life I had always wanted. I was married to a kind man, Daniel, reliable, well-respected, generous in the way people are when they've learned how to love responsibly. He never raised his voice, never made a promise he couldn't keep. But over the years, Daniel's work had become more than just a career. It became a world that no longer had room for me. He was always flying somewhere, building something, solving something, and I stayed behind. It's strange how quiet can be louder than chaos. Each morning, I dressed for meetings that demanded my attention, but never my heart. I answered emails, smiled in video calls, checked off lists. But at the end of every day, I returned to a house that had grown too big for one person's presence. The clinking of a spoon in a teacup, the sound of my own footsteps on hardwood floors, the stillness of a bed untouched on one side. These were the sounds that greeted me more consistently than my husband. But it wasn't the silence of the house that wore me down. It was the silence inside me. I wasn't lonely because I was alone. I was lonely because somewhere along the way, I had stopped showing up for my own life. I had become efficient, reliable, predictable, and invisible, even to myself. There was a time when I used to dance barefoot in the kitchen while making breakfast, when I'd sing out loud in the car just because a song reminded me of something, someone, a version of me that felt awake. That version was long gone, or so I believed, but life, quietly, mysteriously, has its own way of shaking us awake. And for me, that stirring began not with fireworks or some grand revelation, but with something simple. Someone new had just moved in next door. At the time, I had no idea that a stranger named Liam would change everything I thought I knew about myself. At first, Liam was just a shadow in my periphery. Mid-20s, quiet, well-mannered. He moved into the house next door on a rainy Thursday, carrying boxes alone, sleeves rolled up, hair damp from the mist. We exchanged a polite wave as I returned from the market. That was all. There was nothing remarkable about him. Not yet. The following days, we crossed paths occasionally. A small nod by the mailbox. A brief good morning when he passed by on his run. He never lingered, never intruded, but he noticed things. One afternoon, I struggled to carry a heavy bag of garden soil from the trunk of my car. I had done this chore alone a dozen times before, always with quiet frustration. But this time, just as I bent down to lift it, I heard a voice behind me. Need a hand? I turned, and there he was. Liam. His tone was light, almost casual. His smile unassuming. I hesitated. I think I've got it, I replied, though the weight had already made my arms ache. He didn't press, but he also didn't step away. Without another word, he gently reached over and lifted the bag as though it weighed nothing. I stepped aside, startled more by the kindness than the act itself. He placed it beside the garden and looked at me, not with expectation, but with quiet understanding, noticing me in a way I hadn't been noticed in years. Thanks, I said, my voice softer than usual. He just smiled, nodded once, and walked back to his porch. That moment should have been forgettable, but it wasn't, because something subtle shifted. Not in him, in me. After that afternoon, I began to notice Liam more often, not because he was trying to be seen, but because something in me had opened. Sometimes, he'd be fixing something outside, changing a light fixture, trimming the hedge, always with sleeves rolled up and a quiet rhythm to his movements. Other times, he would simply wave from across the lawn, a coffee in one hand, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He never pushed his presence into mine, but he made space for it gently. There was a morning when he helped me realign a loose fence panel. Another time, he brought over a package mistakenly delivered to his doorstep. These weren't grand gestures. They were small, almost invisible, but they landed somewhere deep in me. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, we found ourselves talking for the first time beyond pleasantries. I don't remember what started it. Maybe it was a comment about the weather or the flowers blooming in his front yard. But what I do remember was how effortlessly our conversation stretched, how I forgot to look at the time. He told me he loved old black and white films, Bergman, Truffaut, the quiet kind of cinema that whispers more than it shouts. I hadn't thought of those films in years. They were part of a younger version of me, a version who used to watch them late at night with wine and too many dreams. I used to love Casablanca, I said without thinking. He smiled. Of course you did. There was something in his tone, warm, certain. Like he already knew I had a romantic heart tucked away beneath all that stillness. That night, I sat on my porch long after Liam had gone inside. The air was still, the sky deep blue, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't feel invisible. I wasn't falling for him. Not yet. I was remembering how it felt to be noticed. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the same way they used to be. There was a different kind of silence now, one that hummed with possibility. Not loud, not disruptive, just quietly present, like a note held in the background of a song. Liam stopped by occasionally, sometimes to return something I hadn't realized I left on the porch, sometimes to borrow tools he likely didn't need. Once, he brought over a loaf of bread he'd baked himself, surprisingly good, with hints of rosemary. I make too much when I'm distracted, he said with a soft laugh. I wasn't sure why my hands trembled a little as I sliced it. One evening it rained, the kind of rain that blurs the windows and softens the world outside. I had just finished a long video call and was setting the table for one, again, when I heard a gentle knock at the door. Liam stood there, umbrella in hand, holding a book I had lent him the week before. I figured you might want this back tonight, he said, smiling. It pairs well with stormy weather. I looked at him, and before I could stop myself, the words left my mouth. Would you like to stay for dinner? He hesitated, just for a second, then nodded.
Sure.
I'd like that. In the kitchen, I moved with practiced ease, chopping, stirring, seasoning. Liam leaned against the counter, occasionally offering to help, mostly just keeping me company. We talked about nothing and everything, his childhood summers, my favorite cafe in Florence, his dream of living in a coastal village one day. The smell of olive oil and rosemary filled the space around us, and for a while, it felt like the house belonged to life again, not just memory. At the table, conversation quieted. He passed the salt, and when our hands touched briefly, softly, I felt it, that same strange electricity. Not overwhelming, just real. I looked up. He was already looking at me. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to, because something had shifted again. Not loud, not sudden, just the kind of shift you feel in your chest, like a door inside you has quietly unlocked. After dinner, we moved to the living room. The rain still whispered against the windows, and I lit the fireplace, not because it was cold, but because it felt like the kind of evening that needed warmth. Liam sat across from me on the couch, nursing a cup of tea, his eyes flickering toward the flames. For a while, we didn't speak, not out of awkwardness. There was a comfort in the silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. It was the quiet of being with someone who wasn't trying to fix you, or define you, or even impress you. Just be with you. He told me about a place in Portugal he'd once visited, where the cliffs turned orange at sunset. I told him about the time I got lost in Venice and found the best coffee shop in the world by accident. When I laughed, it was real. When he smiled, it reached his eyes. At one point, I handed him a glass of water. Our fingers brushed, and this time, neither of us pulled away. It wasn't dramatic. There was no music swelling in the background. Just a glance held a little too long, a breath caught in the chest. And then, slowly, naturally, his hand found mine. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. We didn't rush. There were no declarations.
No decisions.
Only presence. When he kissed me, it was quiet, thoughtful. A question, not a conquest. His lips were soft, his touch reverent. And as he leaned in, I didn't think about right or wrong, about past or future. I simply felt the way his hand settled at the curve of my back, felt the stillness of the room break open into something living. There were no fireworks, only a kind of peace I had forgotten was possible. In that moment, I wasn't a woman stepping into danger. I was a woman returning to herself. And somehow he knew. He didn't press, didn't push. He was patient, present. And I, without even realizing, had let the walls around me fall without a sound. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The house was still. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty, but full, like something sacred had just passed through and left behind a trace. Liam was asleep beside me, his chest rising in a soft rhythm. One arm tucked loosely under the pillow, the other resting just close enough that our fingers almost touched. I didn't move. I just watched him in the quiet. There was no guilt, no panic, only a strange, steady warmth that settled in my chest. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waking up to perform a role. I wasn't preparing for a day of meetings, or rehearsing small talk, or navigating the hollow routine I had learned to survive in. I was simply there, fully present, fully human. When Liam opened his eyes, he smiled sleepily, like it was the most natural thing in the world to wake up beside me. "Good morning," he whispered. "Good morning," I whispered back. We didn't say much more. There wasn't a need. Moments later, he got dressed quietly, pulling his sweater over his head, pausing at the door. Before stepping out, he turned to me, his voice soft but certain. "Last night meant something to me." I met his gaze. It did to me, too. And then, just like that, he was gone. But the house didn't feel empty. It felt open, Something had shifted inside me, subtle but unmistakable. I walked through the kitchen, my fingers trailing the edge of the counter. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting golden patterns on the floor. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like I was floating through someone else's life. I felt anchored, awake. It wasn't Liam who had changed me. He had simply reminded me of what was still alive within me, that I was still a woman with feelings, with dreams, with a pulse that hadn't stopped beating, only grown quieter with time. I spent most of that day alone, but it didn't feel like before. The silence no longer echoed like an accusation. It held me, gently, like a pause in the middle of a song you didn't know you needed. I moved through the rooms of my house, not as a ghost gliding past old memories, but as someone newly aware of the present moment. Everything looked the same, and yet everything felt different. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, not adjusting my makeup, not fixing my hair, just looking. The woman staring back at me wasn't younger, wasn't transformed by some sudden magic. Her skin still bore the marks of time, her eyes still held a trace of fatigue, but she was there, not hiding, not shrinking. I hadn't realized how long I had been dimming my own light, how many small pieces of myself I had given away to responsibility, to predictability, to quiet resignation. And for what? To be good?
To be needed?
To be safe? Maybe. But in the safety, I had forgotten what it meant to feel truly alive. What happened with Liam wasn't about rebellion. It wasn't about filling a void. It was a mirror. A soft, unexpected mirror that reflected parts of me I thought were gone. The laughter, the longing, the quiet fire that used to burn under my skin. He didn't give me those things. He reminded me I still had them. Later that evening, I sat on the porch alone, the same place I had sat so many nights before, numb, disconnected, waiting for time to pass. But this time, I wasn't waiting. I was witnessing myself, my breath, my thoughts, the sky. There was no plan, no decision about what would happen next. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the uncertainty. I welcomed it because I knew now that the greatest loss wasn't when someone leaves. It's when we leave ourselves. And I had just started to come home again. The next morning, I received an email from Daniel. Short, efficient. The way most of his messages had become. He'd extended his trip again. No details, no apology.
Just logistics.
We'll talk more when I'm back, he wrote. No date.
No worms.
Just the assumption that I would still be here, waiting, holding the place in his absence.
And for years I
had filled in the silence, painted over the distance with loyalty, with routine, with excuses that sounded noble. He works hard. He's under pressure. This is just a season. But some seasons never end unless you name them. I sat with his words for a long time, not hurt, not angry, just honest. The truth was, Daniel hadn't really seen me in a long time. And maybe I hadn't really let myself be seen either. Our life had become a script we both knew by heart. He played the provider. I played the partner. And somewhere in the perfect performance, we forgot to feel. He was not cruel. He was not careless. He was simply absent, in body, in attention, in intimacy. And I had been disappearing quietly, Not all at once, just fading. Until now, I didn't call him. I didn't cry. I didn't rehearse what I'd say when he finally came home. Instead, I brewed tea, took a deep breath, and stood barefoot in the garden. The air smelled of earth and early sunlight. I felt the coolness of dew under my toes and the rise and fall of my own breath.
And I knew something had changed.
Not in him, in me. Whatever came next, whatever conversation, confrontation, confession, I would face it as a whole person. Not as a role, not as a shadow, but as Elena, a woman who had stopped waiting to be chosen, a woman who had remembered how to choose herself. For days, I didn't reach out to Daniel, and he didn't notice. No calls. No, how are you? No questions. Just the occasional forwarded invoice or itinerary. The language of shared responsibilities, not shared hearts. And strangely, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt released. But when Liam stopped by again, I wasn't sure what to say. He brought coffee this time, 2 cups still warm. He didn't knock, just stood on the porch, like someone gently waiting to be welcomed or quietly ready to leave. "Hey," he said simply. "Hey," I replied. We sat together in the soft morning air. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was fuller now, tinged with something unspoken, something neither of us dared to name. He looked at me, eyes careful. "I don't want to complicate your life." I studied the rim of my cup. "You haven't. You've only made me see it more clearly." His gaze didn't leave mine. "Do you regret that night?" I shook my head.
No.
I regret how long I waited to feel something again. We didn't talk about love or about what this was. We didn't make promises or plans. What we shared wasn't built on declarations. It was built on presence. But I knew this. Liam was not a detour. He was a mirror. And what scared me most wasn't what had happened between us. It was how deeply I had accepted a life that no longer fit me. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at an untouched dinner, and wrote in a notebook I hadn't opened in years. I wrote, "I am not waiting anymore. Not for his return. Not for clarity. I owe myself more than endurance. I owe myself truth." It wasn't a decision. It was a beginning, a small crack in the dam I had built inside myself. A week later, Daniel came home. The suitcase landed by the door with a soft thud. He looked tired, the kind of tired success can't soothe. He walked in like he always did, confident, automatic, assuming the air of someone returning to what had always waited. "Elena," he said, with a nod that once felt warm. "You look different." "I am," I replied. We sat in the living room, the same room where we had once built dreams, shared wine, argued softly over movies, and slowly drifted.
He talked about flights,
About deals, about how things had gone longer than planned. I listened, and for the first time, I wasn't filling in the gaps with hope. He asked how I'd been. I paused, then said gently, "I've been waking up." He looked confused. Waking up from what? I didn't answer. Some truths don't need to be explained. They just need to be honored. I didn't tell him about Liam, not because I was hiding it, but because Liam wasn't the story. I was. That evening, I packed a small bag. Just a weekend's worth. Books, notebooks, walking shoes. "I'm going away for a while," I told Daniel. "Where?" he asked. "I don't know yet." but somewhere I can't hear myself.
He didn't argue. He didn't stop me.
And I didn't need him to, because leaving wasn't about punishing him. Staying hadn't been about loving him. It had always been about me, about the woman I had left behind, the one I was now choosing to meet again. As I closed the front door behind me, I felt no guilt, no fear, just space. Space for possibility, space to become, space to breathe without explanation. And for the first time in years, the silence that followed me wasn't heavy. It was sacred. This is not a story about a man, or a neighbor, or even a marriage. This is the story of a woman who quietly came back to herself after years of forgetting what it felt like to be alive. I don't know where the road ahead leads, but I know now that it begins with me, fully awake and no longer waiting. Bell disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created to explore the quiet emotional shifts that occur when one feels disconnected from themselves and begins the journey back to self-awareness. All characters, events, and scenarios are entirely fictional and are not intended to represent real people or situations. The purpose of this video is to inspire empathy, reflection, and emotional understanding, not to promote or justify any form of unethical behavior in real life.